Hello, good afternoon. Uh, and I know people are joining us from different time zones, so good evening and good morning too. Greetings and a very warm welcome to the University of the Arts London, UAL, and the launch of our research season today. My name is Pratap Rughani. I'm the chair of the university's professoriate. That's the group of our university readers and professors, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to our opening event. More about that in a moment. And the season itself, so far we have over 55 events. About 30 are open to the public. So if you're not a UAL or college person, particularly warm welcome to you. And also it's the first day of our new Vice-Chancellor and President, James Purnell, joining us. So delighted that you can join us too. A couple of housekeeping points and then we'll move to the event proper. For audience, which I think we have over about 160 in the room at the moment, the cameras will be off and the mics are off. But after our presentations from the speakers who I'll introduce a little later, the chat box will be open. And we really welcome you to use that during the discussion and question and answer, and I'll keep an eye on that and field those questions and feed them to our speakers and explore some of the ideas there. The event is being recorded, and I'm really now very happy to hand over to my co-chair, Professor Charlotte Hodes, co-chair of the University Professoriate and professor at the London College of Fashion, who will introduce our Vice-Chancellor, Sir Nigel Carrington.
Thank you, Pratap. Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. Yeah, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce Sir Nigel Carrington on behalf of the Professoriate. Nigel's leadership since joining UAL in 2008 has been characterised by his unequivocal enthusiasm and support for the arts, and in shaping UAL's role both in research and teaching. From the outset, it was clear that Nigel wanted to be fully immersed in our creative community. He has always been both accessible and visible, ever present at openings and other research events, engaging with both students and staff with genuine curiosity and enthusiasm. His termly college briefings demonstrate his inclusivity, ensuring that the priorities and aspirations of the university are shared by all. Nigel has always been committed to research, and this came into sharp focus following the 2014 REF, when government research funding was dramatically reduced. Nigel stepped in to ensure that research remained a high priority. His legacy will be seen as being instrumental in taking UAL, a new university, to being a world-leading force in arts education, respected globally. A further notable aspect of Nigel's leadership has been to upgrade and develop the university estates to ensure that the facilities that we offer to both the students and staff match these aspirations. So Nigel, over to you and welcome.
Thank you, Charlotte. I can't get my video on. Hang on. Yeah. Thank you for those very generous words. It's really been my absolute privilege to be the Vice-Chancellor for the last 13 years. And I was very keen to say a few words today because I do, as you've said, have a really high regard for the Professoriate and all the work that everyone engaged in research at UAL does. It's actually now almost exactly 13 years since I started my induction meetings as the new Vice-Chancellor at UAL, and it's really great to have James Purnell, our new Vice-Chancellor, with us today. And over the last 13 years, I've had an enormous privilege of watching the research community grow and develop. And when I started those induction meetings 13 years ago, there were really two very powerful themes that came through immediately. The first was passion, the passion that members of the Professoriate exhibited for their disciplines. And the second was conviction, the conviction that our work has a crucial role to play in the development of society and the life experiences of communities. And no one witnessing any of those early discussions could have mistaken the work that we do for the stereotypical Daily Mail depiction of the dryly irrelevant research in an irrelevant backwater of the arts and humanities, which sometimes we sadly hear from the media. Those are certainly not characteristics of our work. My discussions with the Professoriate have always been about very real and urgent challenges. So I remember, for instance, not long after I arrived, my conversations with Carol Colley about her work with the Medical Research Council, which involved our interacting with Nobel Prize-winning scientists to shed new ways of describing the ways in which they think and research. And as I think back, I can reflect on Lorraine Gammon's passionate explanations of the social impact of her Design Against Crime unit, which has just grown exponentially over the last 13 years. And then the work led by Toshio Watanabe and Oriana Baddeley, who explained to me the ways in which TRAIN was opening up a greater understanding of transnational art movements, moving us away from our Eurocentric understandings of art practice. And over those early years, I also had inspirational meetings with Kay Politovitz, now an emeritus professor, Dilys Williams, Becky Early, Kate Goldsworthy, and others, about the emerging fields of sustainability and circular design. What's very clear to me as I reflect back on all of those amazing discussions 13 years ago is that the seeds of our subsequent success were sown long before I arrived at UAL. And all of this work, even then, and with much more force and urgency now, is addressing urgent challenges for humanity. And as I reflect on the last decade with UAL, I see two developments which make our research community an even more important powerhouse for change now than it was then. The first is the real awakening across society of the role that creativity can play in averting environmental catastrophe. And the second is the urgent need to address the challenges of equality and diversity as national boundaries evaporate in the face of accelerating technological change. The Black Lives Matter movement has given urgent new impetus to the need to address our actions to address more urgently our actions to ensure that we really are anti-racist. And the pandemic has starkly demonstrated the irrelevance of national boundaries and national ideologies in the face of global challenges in health and climate change. UAL's research community, working closely with colleagues with a focus on knowledge exchange, has answers to many of these challenges. We have amazing people who are poised to make a real impact on both their disciplines and the world, whether they be in our new institutes for decolonizing the arts, the Institute for Social Design, or creative computing. And also in our work in response to climate emergency, sustainability, and the emerging work now funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council at the junctions of fashion, technology, and business. But for all this, the academic world gets no less complex as time goes on. And whilst I think we can celebrate the work of the last 13 years, we also must recognize that our role is now being more comprehensively challenged by many multi-faculty universities, which have perhaps belatedly discovered the potential of our disciplines to enrich their fields of research. So we cannot rest on our laurels. We need a really concerted, continuing effort across the university and in partnership with others. And I know that many others are here for these research events, and we're very happy to welcome you. We need that really concerted effort in partnership with others to exploit the benefits of interdisciplinarity if we're going to succeed over the next decade. But I know, and I know that we're going to hear over the coming weeks, that we have all of the ingredients to go from strength to strength as a major global force in both research and knowledge exchange in our disciplines. And that really brings me to the launch of this research season. Research season, formerly known as Research Fortnight, but now for a whole month, was launched in 2015 to ensure that we showcase the depth and breadth of research undertaken across the university. This new season is continuing virtually throughout March, and during this period, all of our 6 colleges, our 3 institutes, and our 9 research centres are going to be hosting events which showcase the rich diversity of our research, with a special focus on the theme Earth and Equity, integrating environmental and racial justice. There are more than 50 events, more than half of them open to the public. And at those events, we'll all be able to hear about the projects, platforms, and peoples who are working across the university to progress environmental and racial justice. There can be no better way to reflect on the potential of our research at UAL. So this particular launch event focuses on the theme of intersectionality and planetary health. And with my thanks to all of you for everything you've done over the last 13 years, I'm now delighted to hand over to Professor Charlotte Hodes again to introduce the chair of our Court of Governors, David Isaac.
Thank you very much, Nigel. That's fantastic. And thanks very much for launching the season. Yes, as Nigel said, I'm delighted to introduce David Isaac CBE, who's been our chair of the Board of Governors at UAL since 2018. David is ideally placed to address our event today, since he is a leading figure in the realm of shaping social justice and has a lifelong commitment to integrating equality into social policy. Amongst his many achievements, he has been chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission that investigated allegations of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party and the Home Office's hostile environment immigration policy. As chair of Stonewall, he oversaw huge progress in delivering legal equality for LGBTQ people, the abolition of Section 28, and the introduction of civil partnerships. He has also been involved in driving gender and LGBTQ equality in the City of London, and was on the board of Diverse City, which encouraged businesses to support the recruitment of diverse talent. Most recently, he has drawn attention to the manner in which the current pandemic has exposed the vulnerability of disabled people, and how the relationship of the debate about race is related to the inequality of opportunity and poverty. Personally, I think it is rare to have someone schooled in the precision of law who is also able to bring their own personal experience and empathy to bear on issues of inclusivity that we are all wrestling with. Thank you, David, and over to you.
Great. Charlotte, thank you so much. That's very kind of you, and thank you for those very warm words. Can I also just add to the comments that have been made about Nigel's leadership of the university for the last 13 years. Nigel, there'll be many opportunities for us to say thank you and goodbye, but I think today's event and all of the events that are going to happen during this month are testimony to your leadership of UAL in terms of the platform that you've provided to enable creativity and interconnectivity to flourish in the way that they have. So thank you for your introduction. Thank you for your great leadership. And can I also say welcome to James. James will build upon the great work that Nigel has done, and I'm looking forward to working closely with James as we move into the next stage of the life of UAL. I'm sure I'm not alone in worrying about how we avert environmental catastrophe, but also how we create, as Charlotte says, a fair and inclusive world, and one that works for everyone. And I think creativity is a key ingredient to addressing those issues. And it's for that reason that I think the theme of today's discussion is really very relevant, particularly as we're still working and living at home, and as we aspire to build back not just better, but for many of us, how we build back fairer. And we know that the planetary issues and environmental concerns are absolutely key and have played out during the pandemic, because in the UK, it is those from BAME and socially disadvantaged backgrounds who have fared worse, but also in relation to global challenges, we know that there will be massive inequalities in the way that the vaccine is rolled out, but also those who are already impacted hugely by environmental disadvantage. I haven't got a huge amount of time to talk this afternoon, but I've been asked just to share a few quick thoughts in relation to my view on intersectionality, which I think is absolutely key to the work that UAL is doing, not just this month, but for the future. And I was just keen to share two quick observations in relation to what I saw as chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission for Great Britain. And it really builds upon the great work that Kimberlé Crenshaw did in relation to identifying intersectionality as an important legal tool, but also as a way of thinking and how we unite rather than divide people. And so my first observation is that sadly, some people see intersectionality as an oppression framework or a means by which an oppression framework is built. And I was just keen to remind everybody that the Equality and Human Rights Commission was built on the basis that intersectionality was key, not to competing protected characteristics against one another, but also but more importantly, to provide an important focus whereby that community of interest and the overlapping concerns of people with protected characteristics and those who support them could actually provide a greater focus to address change. And the second point is that fairness itself and the ending of discrimination isn't a zero-sum game. And time again, as chair of the EHRC, I saw that people saw fairness and equality as not just one cake, but a very small cake, where if you advance the rights of one group, you disadvantage the rights of another. And that is just not the case. And I think building upon that, I see the role of creativity as hugely important in making really intelligent, emotional, but also powerful connections to enable us to see the world differently. And I just wanted to give two examples of work that's moved me recently. And the first one is the powerful action by Mayor Muriel Bowser in Washington, when she didn't just rename the street outside the White House Black Lives Matter Plaza. She actually painted Black Lives Matter in huge yellow letters on the road outside the White House. And you know, what more powerful statement of not just political intent, but also powerful, creative response as that image was photographed and broadcast around the world. And the second example is in relation to the work of John Akomfra's great film, Purple. And for those of you who haven't seen it, I'd urge you to watch it again, because that creative perspective and different way of seeing things is hugely important and so central to what UAL does. I just wanted to end very, very briefly by reading something from James Baldwin, who I've been using as a bit of a guide recently to get me through some of the challenges that we're all facing in relation to not just COVID, but also in relation to Black Lives Matter, the continuing challenges that we find in relation to social disadvantage, but also intolerance of difference. I can't say anything more eloquently than him, except to say that it's important that we remember that he wrote this the year before he died, nearly 40 years ago, but it's as true, sadly, today as it was then. We're living in a world in which everybody and everything is interdependent. It is not white, this world. It is not black either. The future of this world depends on everyone, and that future depends on to what extent and by what means we liberate ourselves from a vocabulary which now cannot bear the weight of reality. Liberation from the languages and categories that box us in requires that we tap the source of it all, free ourselves of the lie, and start this whole damn thing over. I hope you enjoy the rest of this afternoon. Thank you for inviting me. And Charlotte, am I going to hand back to you?
I think it's thanks very much. Yeah, over to Pratap. Thank you
very much. Thank you, Nigel and David. And God, that's such a powerful quote from Baldwin. I was watching Meeting the Man, one of the last works that he film works that he was involved in. I might say something about that later, but thank you very much for that. So now we move to our event proper. The title of this, as you know, is Planetary Health and Intersectionality. Planetary Health and Intersectionality. What do we mean by those things? So to explore this with passion and commitment are our two speakers, David Cross and Janine François. And together they're going to propose that the huge social, political, cultural, environmental and health challenges of our time must be understood in an integrated way collectively in the context of each other. And the way they're going to do that is they're going to present, they're going to do about a 11 minute presentation, first Janine and then David. Then for about 3 or 4 minutes, they're going to respond to each other, and then we're going to move to questions and answers. So I will introduce our first speaker now, Janine François. She is a Black British feminist critic and writer. Janine's practices deconstruct whiteness and race within cultural and academic institutions through writing, curating, producing, research, teaching, consultancy. She's acting course leader of the BA in Culture, Criticism and Curation at Central St Martin's. I think she's just come from teaching a class there this afternoon. And she set up our first ever hip hop cultures module. She's also a PhD candidate at the University of Bedfordshire and the Tate, and exploring, this is the doctoral question, if Tate can be a safer space to discuss issues of race and cultural differences within a teaching and learning context. And that's funded by the AHRC. So over to Janine. We'll give you a time check just before finishing, and then we'll move on to introduction to David Cross. So thanks so much, Janine, and over to you.
Thank you, Pratap, for the introduction. You made me sound really important for a minute. So my contribution is titled as this, I'm reading for context, and it's Can Culture Institutions Care for Us? In 2012, the British Museum outsourced all of its cleaners, porters, technicians, plumbers, and electricians, most of whom are migrant, women, Black, Indigenous people of colour, working class peoples, and the intersections thereof. These are now the very same group of people most impacted by labour precarity and premature death during this global pandemic. People who were once employed in roles to take care of institutions with very little care given back to them in return. The British Museum is not unique here. Many cultural institutions on both sides of the Atlantic have fallen foul to outsourcing as a way to save costs, but for whom? Outsourcing forces us to question the very ethics of cultural institutions like the British Museums, whose existence is predicated upon the exploitation of some people for the enjoyment of others. Care has been defined as a species of activities that includes everything we do to maintain, contain and repair our world so we live in as well as possible, write psychologists Angela Dutt and Daria Koepfeld. This world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environments, they write. Many of us are socialized to care for those with dominant or privileged identities, both interpersonally and structurally. Consequently, empathy and more importantly, care are highly prized commodities that depend upon the luck of one's social identities. This is evident when we apply this thinking to race. Institutionalized care is not only a physiological or psychological need, but a social and cultural one mediated by micro and social relationships. Institutional racism, may I add, first coined by Starkey Carmichael in 1967 and not Lord Macpherson in 1999, explains the existence of racist discrimination on a macro level. Carmichael understood institutionalized racism as less overt, more subtle, less identifiable in terms of specific individuals committing the acts, but no less destructive on human life. And Macpherson described it in his 1999 report as the collective failure of an organization to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their color, culture, or ethnic origin. And whilst 32 years apart, both Carmichael and Macpherson understood that racism informs our inability to institutionalize and or legitimate care for BIPOC to deeply ingrained racial attitudes. Cultural institutions like the British Museum cannot declare support for Black Lives Matter or claim they are decolonizing to some effect without examining the interconnection of colonization on outsourcing of labor and the racial unequal workforces, as well as the theft of cultural artifacts on display. Several centuries of European imperialism has printed itself into biases around who we employ, how we employ, and what we create. Museums, botanical gardens, universities, heritage sites, and many other cultural institutions are all implicated in such histories and tensions. If cultural heritage and institutions can be moved to fund resources and department to care and preserve collections obtained through colonial violence, then surely they can be moved to dismantle relationships that maintain imperialism by centering an ethics of care as their primary practice of operation. These collections are not dead, but they live through the bodies of cultural descendants, often the very same migrant cleaners who are employed to take care of their sites for these very same collections. As a result of 500 years of white Western imperialism, BIPOCs are now increasingly becoming climate migrants. Yet the British Museum, like several other high-profile institutions, like the Royal Opera House and the National Portrait Gallery, to name but a few, has stubbornly remained in corporate partnership with British Petroleum, whose long and nefarious practices are underpinned by centuries of colonialism and extractive capitalism. Some of the Earth's worst oil spills are all in the global south and involve BP, like the 2010 oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. The effect this has on local communities is not only damaging, but long-lasting, from dwindling and contaminated food supplies, loss of incomes, and of course, migration to bigger cities and abroad. We can't disaggregate that we have a high population of people from Latinx communities who are in outsourced position and then not think about climate change, right? For the British Museum to be bold enough to host a current exhibition called Arctic Culture and Climate, centered around Indigenous people's objects, how cultural institutions can reshuffle BIPOC's causes like a pawns in a game of chess. Affiliations with companies such as BP, directly involved in further Arctic drilling, undermine the performance support for important causes such as climate justice and Black Lives Matter. So effectively what I'm saying is this: you can't be in support of Black Lives Matter and still be working in corporate partnerships whose kind of modus operandi is about extractive capitalism. Those two things do not coexist together. MoMA, founded in New York in 1929 and financially supported by the petroleum-based company fortune of the Rockefeller family, has also come under fire by an activist collective called Decolonize This Place. In Fuck MoMA, an open call to action, the collective argue that MoMA is complicit in oppression globally, not because it has failed to be truly inclusive in its collection and programming or staffing, but despite scrabbling to make public commitments to equity and diversity following the Black Lives Matter protests, this Decolonize This Place insists that with predatorial billionaires at its helm, the museum has been a clearinghouse for capital, a showcase for domination, and an ecocidal machine. The numerous great white male statues we have within our cultural institutions and in our public spaces are very conspicuous examples of colonial violence. Despite making the public decision to rename from Robert Diffrin Museum to the Museum of the Home, it's very strange that the museum would still keep its statue on its ground, located in Hackney, a borough of one of the highest African and Caribbean populations in London. However, in London alone, there were 39 statues erected in the 19th and 20th century, most of them directly and indirectly celebrate colonialists. The UK government is currently planning new legislation to protect statues and act to design everyday citizens from creating our own public space. And that's a form of epistemic violence in terms of telling us who we are and not allowed to celebrate, or who we feel enact colonial violences. And I want us to think about how that impacts Black and brown people's everyday psychogeography and how they relate to these spaces, right? With a government legislation telling us we can't take statues down. The violence here is plural. Colonialism is presented as benevolent and historically presents violence in the contemporary and everyday spaces, psychologically impacting the marginalized peoples whose biographies were oppressed by imperialism. Even in death, white male lives are rehumanized at the expense of Black lives. The cultural and legal safeguarding of such statues not only demonstrates to BIPOC that our emotionality is redundant, but the privileging of dead white men dishonors our own histories that were brutalized during the colonial regimes, let alone how we as descendants must now contend with the everyday realities of structural colonialism. The public reaction to removing such statues tell us how empathy is not only racialized but gendered, but it greatly informs which histories should be cared for and preserved, and which histories are worth explaining and remembering and which are not. To think radically about institutionalized care is to reject that humanity and its ecosystems are rooted in and for privileged bodies. Jamaican academic Sylvia Winter would argue that humanity itself is the outcome of the colonial project. Institutionalized ethics of care have the possibility to exist as a radical position that disrupts micro and macro empathy gaps, where a rewiring of our empathy levels become constituent to those whose lives are governed by marginalization and oppression. In non-Western contexts, Indigenous people have already conceptualized a world that is non-hierarchical in terms of human and non-human relations, where care is its central function. However, the erasure of Indigenous knowledge and centuries of epistemic violence means we now have to arrive at this current state. We live in a world where people are systemically denied access to care due to social inequalities. And if we are truly committed to decolonization, climate justice, labour rights, and many other important political causes, then we must be equally committed to reordering our current human, non-human, and planetary relationships. If cultural institutions are going to lobby around political causes that are in vogue, then they have to also undertake deep and iterative work which asks themselves, how are injustices intersectional, and constantly, who and what do we really care about? A practice of an ethics of care would understand how BIPOC lives are entangled across geographies, temporalities, histories, and artificial borders. Institutions who declare themselves to be in support of Black Lives Matter, but are willing to risk our lives for profit, are not my allies. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is David Cross, and he will give an equally clear position, and then they'll explore each other's positions, then we'll go to the broader Q&A. Let me introduce David. So David Cross is an artist and reader at University of the Arts London. His research, practice and teaching engage with the social ecological crisis in relation to visual culture. Recognising the conflict between his internationalism and his environmentalism, he stopped using jet travel in 2005. In 2012, following the Artist Placements Group, he designated his role at UAL as an artist's placement and proposed that UAL switch to an ethical bank. With students, David campaigned for UAL to divest £3.9 million from fossil fuels, which in 2015 it pledged to do. David is now advocating that UAL integrates decarbonisation and decolonisation as a start towards regenerative ecology and restorative social justice. And David, you have 10 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you, Pratap. That's very kind. So I'm just going to share screen now, because I'd like to show you some images to take through the points I'm going to make. The concept of planetary health connects physical and mental well-being to social systems and ecological health. The discourse around planetary health relates health inequality to the legacy of colonialism and to racism today, whilst also recognising cultural differences in how people relate to the planet. By creatively engaging with planetary health, art, design and the humanities could help to integrate ecological regeneration and restorative justice. The COVID-19 pandemic and the climate emergency are symptoms of the underlying social, ecological crisis, a complex of wicked problems and injustices that can only be resolved with new ways of thinking. Warning that 1 million species face extinction, the United Nations has called for transformative change, which they define as a fundamental, system-wide reorganisation across technological, economic and social factors, including paradigms, goals and values. Planetary health offers a vital focus. Set out as a manifesto in 2014 by Richard Horton and colleagues at the Lancet Medical Journal, planetary health is defined as the health of human civilization and the natural systems on which it depends. Western medical science is based on systems within the human body. Planetary health broadens health research to include the external systems that sustain or threaten human health. Planetary health draws on the work of the Stockholm Resilience Institute, which has identified 9 planetary boundaries in the Earth system. 4 of these boundaries have already been breached. Climate change, near the top of this diagram. Moving clockwise, we come to nitrogen and phosphorus overload, mostly from agriculture. Continuing on, we come to land system change, and at the top, destruction of biosphere integrity. Research shows that it was the destruction of biosphere integrity driven by land system change that enabled the COVID-19 virus to pass from wild animals to humans in 2019. Soon, forest destruction may be recognised in international law as the crime of ecocide, but it can already be seen as an aesthetic tragedy. Tropical rainforests are home to the most significant biodiversity in the world. But to see tropical forests as places of uninhabited nature is not just a mistake, it is an insult. Tropical forests have been nurtured for thousands of years by indigenous communities, such as the people of the Dongria Khond in northern India. Dongria Khond means protector of streams, and these people successfully opposed a mining project by the Vedanta Corporation that would have destroyed their forest and streams and erased their culture. Tropical forests are key to reversing climate breakdown because they lock up so much carbon. In the Amazon, the ancient practice of burying charcoal improves soil fertility by holding water, minerals and nutrients, but it also stores carbon for thousands of years. Research by the Rights and Resources Initiative shows that by maintaining the integrity of their forests, indigenous peoples and local communities manage 300,000 million tonnes of carbon. The world depends on tropical forests for medicines, including anaesthetics, antibiotics, cancer drugs, contraceptives, muscle relaxants and pain relievers. So who would destroy tropical forests and why? Well, among the worst destroyers of tropical rainforests are producers of palm oil. Research by the Rainforest Action Network shows that popular snack foods contain illegal palm oil produced on destroyed rainforest land, even in wildlife reserves. Meanwhile, cattle ranching, which began under Spanish and Portuguese colonisation, accounts for 80% of Amazonian deforestation today. Amazonian beef is sold in China and in the UK, in Burger King, the military and the NHS. And corned beef from cattle ranched in the Amazon is sold in UK supermarkets, Asda, Lidl, Morrisons and Sainsbury's. John Middleton, President of the UK Faculty of Public Health, has charted the drivers of emerging infectious diseases. The 2 highest are land use change and food industry change. The lowest driver is bushmeat. Yet with the outbreak of COVID-19, English language media ignored the risks of industrial meat production and focused instead on wet markets where wild animals are slaughtered and sold for food and traditional medicine. medical research does show that wet markets enable zoonotic disease transmission. But the way that the media framed this as the source of the pandemic played on a racialized fear of contamination. Both the origin of the pandemic and its impacts have been subject to a racialized framing that has delayed an accurate diagnosis. At first, media reports said that the COVID-19 virus does not discriminate. True enough. But the pandemic has had a devastating impact on people of colour. In June 2020, Public Health England acknowledged that people of colour face disproportionate risks of catching COVID-19 and of dying from it. The causes include a combination of housing, occupation and income inequalities, all of which are compounded by racism and discrimination. In his 2010 book, Sacrifice Zones, Steve Lerner describes how, in the USA, people of colour produce less pollution than white people, but are more exposed to it. The slow violence of air pollution was followed in 2020 by repeated lockdowns to limit the spread of a virus that attacks the lungs. Then came the deliberate suffocation of a black citizen by a white police officer. The last words of George Floyd rallied people around the world against his murder and against the structural racism that allowed it. Defending the right to breathe is a biopolitical struggle that connects the environmental and social justice movements. The Amazon forests are known as the lungs of the planet because they draw in carbon dioxide and give out oxygen. For decades, the photographer Sebastião Salgado has portrayed indigenous peoples in Amazonia. In 2020, he warned that these guardians of the forest face genocide from COVID-19 as President Bolsonaro encourages illegal logging and ranching on their land. This pattern of contemporary injustice continues the historical crimes of colonialism. Following the invasion of Latin America by Christopher Columbus in 1492, European colonizers committed countless atrocities in order to subjugate and enslave the indigenous peoples. From their own land, the indigenous people were forced to clear forests and then mine gold and silver, which the colonizers stole from them and took back to Europe. The colonizers also infected the indigenous peoples with diseases, including smallpox. As researchers at UCL and University of Leeds have shown, the resulting epidemics killed 90% of the indigenous people. So many people died that their civilization collapsed, and the land that they had cultivated for centuries reverted to forest. Jean Ray has declared that in the 6th mass extinction, it is no longer permissible to think genocide apart from ecocide. In the end game of modernity, these processes are knotted and unfold from the same supremacist logics and fantasies. What are the cultural roots of this disturbing phenomenon? In 1982, Fritjof Capra diagnosed what he called a crisis of perception in Western thinking, rooted in the dualistic separation of mind and matter which had been developed in the 17th century by René Descartes. Capra related the split between mind and body in Western medicine to the reductionist analysis of living systems, which focuses on their smallest functional units. In reductionist thinking, and in the mechanistic model of the universe, Capra saw misrecognitions driving conflict, ecological destruction, and physical and mental illness. Capra was influenced by Gregory Bateson, who related insights from psychology, anthropology, and systems theory to identify interconnected networks of the human, society, and ecosystem. Bateson focused on how these networks are all characterized by non-linear causality and dynamic feedback loops. Bateson's work informed Felix Guattari's thesis of the three ecologies, in which Guattari says, To understand the interactions between ecosystems, the mechanosphere, and the social and individual universes of reference, we have to learn to think transversally. Transversal thinking challenges dualistic separations by cutting across categories and disciplinary boundaries and recognizing patterns and similarities between things that are conventionally kept apart. I believe that as practice-based researchers in art and design, thinking transversally is what we do. In this time of planetary sickness, political leaders have normalised the risk of disease and death in order to maintain business as usual. Yet responding like a collective immune system, many people have shown kindness and solidarity and cooperated to achieve a new balance between continuity and change. So how might artists and designers engage with this ambiguous time? And what insights might be drawn from the uncertainties and contradictions of the pandemic? To address these and other questions, Gabrielle Grigorieva and I are collaborating to offer a creative sanatorium for artists and designers. Sadly, it won't be at a spa in the mountains or a castle in the forest. It's just a set of 3 sessions online. But in an ethos of trust and respect, the aim is to begin exploring how creative interaction relates to mental well-being, social transformation, and planetary. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, David. Gosh, that was 2 incredibly rich and challenging presentations. The format, just to remind us, is we'll now go to Janine for a short sort of 3-4 minute response to David. They have got distinct emphases and positions, and then David will do the same. As they're doing that, can I invite anybody who's got a question or a comment to use the chat box? I'll keep an eye on that and we'll feed that into the Q&A that will follow after. So Janine first, thanks.
Sure, thank you, David. I really enjoyed witnessing and your presentation. These are just kind of some loose structures of points that came up, right? So firstly, who is the we in climate change? Because it ain't me. I want to be really clear. And I say that because we use this language of we as if it's a universalism, as if everyone's equally complicit in the destruction of our planet. And that in itself is a Eurocentric framing of this universalism that we all have some kind of equal part to pay. And we see that, for example, with consumers having to pay 5p, right, for you know, a plastic bag. There's like some kind of like consumer-based response to our kind of like participation in plastic kind of destroying the planet. I mean, we really kind of like peel back about, you know, it's about a few hundred corporations in the Western world. And let's be real, at the helm of them are white men who are the ones involved in the kind of destruction of our planet. And when we don't have the accountability in place, it leads to this next point of racism kills. Right, and I want us to think about racism as not just a structural or institutional issue. It's a public health issue. Like racism is a public health issue. It's actually killing me. It's killing me, whether that is the fact that I live in a part of East London, which is predominantly Black and brown people. I live in Newham, where we have one of the highest air pollution alongside Tower Hamlets. I'm more likely to breathe in really poor air by way I'm positioned in life, and that's not unique to me. And at the same time, I'm also more likely to experience you know, fatalities from interacting with the police or other systems of brutalities that has racism embedded in at the helm, right? So when you had that, the slide of I can't breathe, my brain went into those 2 places. Like I literally cannot breathe in fresh air. And I've literally had witnessed police brutality where my breath has gone. Like I have had anxiety, not because I was a victim, but because I was being traumatized seeing another Black person be brutalized in that way. And so when we understand that racism kills and that racism is a public health issue, it perhaps then reorientates that we need to think bigger beyond the ideas and metrics of like equality and diversity and inclusion, because what are we including people into? Like what is it that we're diversing and what are we making equal? And when we kind of unpick that language, it's about us accepting or understanding that we're asking people who exist in quote unquote the other to be implicated into systems that are seek to like designed to cause them harm. The other point that I wanted to tie into of Racism Kills is the ways in which racial science just doesn't seem to go away. It's like we can't seem to shake eugenicist ways of thinking. And by that, I mean, it's the ways in which we see COVID and how, in particularly, the rise in anti-Chinese or anti-Asian racism as being these kind of like somehow distinctly different people that aren't quite human, that have this very kind of different way of life, and that this is their disease. Like they have caused some kind of destruction onto like white Western humanity. And we have to think about that leads into ideas of the hostile environment and immigration policies of people invading the West, right? People coming in here to the UK to take away, and I say people as in like non-white people taking away white people's supposedly ways of lives. So we can't disaggregate the ways in which racial sciences forms ideas of kind of like microbiopolitics in how we treat different types of bodies of color of being destruction or destructive to the kind of social fabrics and quote unquote British or Western life. And then the last point that I want to kind of lean into is the idea of epistemic violence and the ways in which we are dealing with the legacies of epistemic violence by Indigenous people. And I don't want to, you know, nature, I want to make it really clear, is a social construction, right? So the idea of there being a distinction of human life, people, nature comes out of Enlightenment thinking and rhetoric. And so when we kind of understand that as like, we're talking about nature as a socially conceptualized place, within kind of like white imperial imaginations, we then have to think about how do Indigenous people have conceptualized quote unquote nature not in that realm, but also how we're dealing with now the legacies of the extractive capitalism of places that actually uphelm our cultural industries, which is why I started with talking about cultural industries, to really make it really clear, like we can't talk about conversations around ecological damage and racism if we don't look at how culture in its capital C sense is inherently implicated in kind of imperial ideologies. And that's kind of like the notes that I've made, I think.
Actually, thank you. That's really dense. There's a whole series of things that we probably want to unpack in the Q&A. But David, could I first invite you to respond to the presentation? You might want to pick up something that she said just now as well, but it's really with you. We've got 3-4 minutes.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you, Janine. That was incredibly rich. I find it so inspiring the way you tackle these things with a ferocity, but not an anger or an adversarial approach. It's extraordinary, because I often get angry when I see the injustices and foolish mistakes being made in the world, which are kind of suicidal or murderous. I get furious and I get quite emotional about it sometimes, and that destabilizes the kind of calm that I need to approach it in a more dispassionate way. So I admire your tone as well as your tenacity and the precision of your gaze. The we is a very important thing. The universalizing we, presuming to speak on behalf of somebody else. I think in a way for me, what's so wonderful about the intersectional mode of analysis is that it shows that there isn't even a singular I, much less a unified we. And yet at the same time, I think there is a challenge to identify common cause. Is it possible that people who've got different class interests, different subjectivities, different identities, to still act in concert? Because there is an existential threat to the life support systems on Earth, which has been massively unequally wielded and massively unequally experienced. An enormous Truth and Reconciliation Council is needed to weigh up the beneficiaries of colonialism and extractivism and imperialism, and to see whether their great achievements, how great they would be if we could take away the privilege that was the basis for their gaining. So is there a way that, despite this incredible unresolved injustice, that still it's possible to find common cause? Because if we can't, my fear is that we're not going to make it. Whoever the we is, humanity is not going to survive the destructive effects of extractive, imperialist, patriarchal, racist capitalism. It can't be done by singular individuals acting in terms of their individual lifestyle choices. We need collective action. And so when I say we there, I'm talking about the people who broadly have a progressive agenda that want to overcome all forms of oppression and domination, not just the ones they're subject to or the ones they collude in, but wherever they are. So that problem of the I and the problem of the we, I think, is central to identity politics and to the so-called creative industries, the arts, which for so long have emphasized individual competitive achievement and a kind of unique subjectivity. And yeah, I suppose the agenda there of focusing on individuals who've made extraordinary achievements and advantages, the etiquette is to turn around and say, well, it was a team effort, and I'd just like to thank the people that supported me. But the system is hardwired to encourage a separate approach between people. And wouldn't it be better if it were possible to identify larger grounds on which it were possible to cooperate? So I'm a yearning idealist, in a sense that one day it might be possible to own up and tell the truth about the horrors that have been done and our relationship to them. And I say our in terms of the white community. If that's possible, I'd love to be part of it. And I think that intersectionality offers a way forward. My key proposition would be that the transversal thinking of institutional transformation that Guattari proposed could somehow link to the recognition of who each of us is as citizens and subjects, maybe, as multiple persons in endless reconfigurations of social relation.
David, for people who perhaps haven't studied Guattari, do you want to just unpack what you mean by transversalism?
Yes, Guattari was in the heady days of 1968 a psychoanalyst who worked in a psychoanalytic clinic. He worked within the French system, a rigid bureaucratic republic that stamped out patterns for how people who are designated as mentally ill should be treated, medicalized, split off from the rest of society and subject to a kind of, I suppose, a reductive scrutiny that would look at their symptoms in terms of a problem without turning back on itself and saying, how is it that society produces so many people who can't cope with the contradictions it generates? So the production of madness, in a way, as Foucault has looked at it, was something that Guattari engaged with directly and said, we need to heal. We, the medical profession that designates the mind as separate from the body and the ill person as separate from the rest of society. And so he proposed changing places, that actually the patients and I think the cleaners, the administrative staff and the doctors would swap roles and actually run the institution on a kind of rotating basis to see whether how things would change. I don't know how it worked out, but it's an extraordinary proposition that we could change roles in society. The experiment he proposed there was that we could understand people's positions, maybe by stepping into their shoes temporarily, we'd experience something different from the roles which we attribute to ourselves. They could be exchanged and swapped in different permutations. So I think in a way that there's a link there between transversal thinking, which cuts across disciplinary boundaries and designated roles, and intersectionality, which admits a kind of multiplicity of potential within each of us.
Thank you. Well, we got 10, 12 minutes for Q&A. I don't know if you've got your eye on what's coming in the chat, but before we go to that, there's a comment from Professor Malcolm Quinn there in relation to Bourdieu. But I just want to stay with this idea that you're shuffling between you. What does we mean? How do we understand a collective in that way? On the one hand, Janine's talking about the centrality of decolonial narrative. On the other hand, we inherit a range of other dominant narratives. We're a university that needs to be good at navigating these different positions in order to tell tell a unified story. It may not be unified, but in order to create our artwork, films, productions, design, media, and so on. Can either of you talk a little bit about how we move from juxtaposition and listening to other voices towards some kind of more integrated narrative? Or are we facing much harder choices where that integration is more problematic? What do you think?
Janine, your turn.
I mean, integration into what though? I mean, like, what am I being integrated into is often a system that is designed to take any form of power away from me, right? I personally know that I have power, I have agency. But I think it's really important when we talk about creating combined narrative or multiplicity in narratives, that we are quite honest in how we don't have them in the first place. And I often tend to find we like to ahistoricize history and ahistoricize the contemporary reality and the material reality in which we experience ourselves in. And personally, I find that quite frustrating and also just quite disingenuous. So I'm a big believer in this, and being honest and being really transparent, like what is the actual structures, what do we find ourselves in and why, and how does this impact people? So that's a really important conversation of just vulnerability. And I think institutional cultures are designed not to be vulnerable, because vulnerability is seen as being weak or powerless, which actually isn't the case. There's a lot of vulnerability in holding and maintaining power. And then the second aspect is also power sharing. So institutional culture is designed to have power over and not power with. And so what does it mean to think about a different mode of power sharing with people in our structures? So what I mean by that is, I'm going to keep talking about outsourcing, and that might make people feel really uncomfortable, but I made this particular point to David to explain why I feel very strongly about it. I'm a Black woman on a part-time contract, right? I still exist in precarity, and my precarity isn't any different to a woman of color who might be migrant on a 0-hour contract. Actually, there isn't much disconnection between our relationships. We're on the same element of existing in a kind of patriarchal and colonial structure. So when we kind of understand that our relationships are existing in the same kind of employment precarity because of conditions of capitalism and coloniality, then we can be much more honest about who do we need to really serve and protect, and who is at the bottom of that hierarchy. And what I tend to find is that we don't want to have those uncomfortable conversations, because it means having to take accountability of how power gets reproduced and harms people. And if we're not willing to do that, then we can't even begin the conversation of like integrated narratives.
Got it, thanks. And David, I know very important to you is looking very honestly at positionality and being embodied, and what the experience of the three of us, for example, might be, very differently in the world. And do you want to say anything about that? I know you've researched in this area.
Well, it's not just research, really. What happened to me was when I came to St. Martin's School of Art in 1986, I began to see retrospectively what had happened to me through my own education. I went to it's fair to say, all white boys' grammar school, English grammar. And they never used words like racism, but they were racist. And they never used words like homophobia or patriarchy. They didn't discuss concepts like capitalism. And that was how they inculcated them into me, was that the culture, the double culture of the lesson program was only the surface of it. The truth was in the duality of the bullying and the aggressions in the playground, where you had to absorb toxic masculinity. That was the way to survive, and perpetrate it on others in order to be accepted within the hierarchy. And there was a double hierarchy there of bullying in the playground, and then prefects and teachers in the school. And when I came out from school, I mean, I hated it. I loved it in one way, with the pursuit of excellence and the performance and the acquisition of skills, but only later came to realize that those things were the surface for the underlying process of indoctrination. And it was art school that helped me start to rethink those things, where we have a more open process of questioning. Critical thought in the Frankfurt European tradition began the process of reflexivity for me. And I think that we've got again, I keep falling into it, it's inscribed right in the words I use all the time, but there's a long way to go to extend and develop that to a truly planetary consciousness, away from the micro world of private interest and national affiliations. To get to a truly planetary consciousness, I think would be revolutionary in the sense of a thoroughgoing transformation of social relations. So my personal experience is something that inflects and informs the kind of work I make as an artist and the kind of questions I ask as a researcher. And I think that not separating who we are as people from who we are as public intellectuals or as creative industry professionals, that we don't divide ourselves, that we reunite ourselves, is a way to remove some of the ideological barriers that continually get reproduced in the world around us. So that's an attempt to make a start, in a way, at a unification, not as a universalizing project, but a personal integration to avoid these divisions which are constantly foisted on us.
I see, and I know, Janine, very close to your heart is interconnectedness, and live that kind of visceral connective tissue between peoples, and you're identifying places where that is not connecting. I'm seeing things appearing in the chat, and I just want to see if we can be enriched by those observations. So Lucy is saying, how can we were going to come to this at the end, but let's go to it now. Decolonisation and decarbonisation to be urgently worked on by everyone. Here's a question: how can institutions like ours ensure this is a responsibility of all staff and students and no longer be avoided? What are our thoughts on that?
I mean, I'm mindful we got the VC in the room, but I would welcome us to be transparent about who we're working with in terms of corporate relationships and where that money goes, right? So if we were transparent about what that meant, then we can be really transparent and honest about what that means when that money comes back to us for my salary, for whatever, and the ways that trickles down. So I want to just really kind of helm in the point of, like, extractive capitalism isn't also just about taking from the planet, it's also about taking from my resource, right, as a person, and it's taking from the resource, and that the taking from me as a resource isn't any different as a set of politics to the taking from the planet. So if we have a university that is meant to be working to be an anti-racist, and I have to accept that's what they're saying, and decolonising the curriculum, then it means that we're not just decolonising one part of the university, it's everything, right? It's where we put the money, who we work in partnership, who we employ, obviously what we teach, our HR, like, it's the entire shebang. We can't do things in silos. And that's where we see a kind of, I don't you know,
sorry, I'm going to interrupt you there because you froze for a moment, so we won't talk your last comment. But I think one of the things I'm hearing is a much closer scrutiny of what we mean, for example, by ethical investment. That broad word, ethical, which we know the concepts of greenwashing and so on. So am I getting you right that you would look for a much more precise understanding and the criteria being open to scrutiny and more of a consensus building around where capital is invested and what we offer our students, the environment that they're coming into? Go on, I don't want to speak for you.
Precisely just that, and it's understanding that this is a circular process. So when we're talking about decolonising the curriculum, and then we're also, I don't know if we do, because I would like to have transparency, if we're potentially working or investing or have relationships with companies that do very extractive form of capitalism or harming the planet, then we're not decolonising the curriculum. We're not doing anything at all. We're just saying stuff. And so this is what I mean, like, we can't disaggregate these relationships. We can't say things and not do them. I find that really frustrating. So that's the kind of institution that I would like to see to respond to that question, that we really are practicing what we're preaching. And that can actually be very powerful because that can set the tone for other institutions to follow.
Great. In a way, your hopeful kind of vision there, it answers Maria Walsh's point there, which is, you know, I'm sure true in many, many cases. But you have the articulation of a different kind of hope, that at the edge of these, well, you've referred to the genocide and the ecocide needing to be handled together, the structural injustices together. This is about helping conceive, giving birth to a new way of working. We've got about 4 minutes left. David, did you want to come back on either of those comments?
Yes. I would actually, just very briefly to pick up, I absolutely share Janine's insistence that we cannot continue the separation into silos, the different elements. Just as with the human body, we can't simply talk about the health of our lungs separate from the overall health of the being, and we can't talk about the health of the body separate from the health of the mind. In the institution, similarly, the transformation must be thoroughgoing and wide-ranging. But I'm looking for concrete mechanisms by which to achieve these ideals. And one of them is the Higher Education and Research Act of 2017, which lays in provision for universities to change their structures of governance, to transfer their assets, with the sole proviso that they must continue to dispense their actions in the public interest. So at that time, I proposed and said we could use this for a really emancipatory purpose and remodel UAL as a cooperative. What would it look like if the members of staff, the academics, right to the top of the executive, we were members of a cooperative with effective ownership and control over the institution? And that would change all sorts of things, from the ratio of pay of the Vice-Chancellor to what the cleaners' employment terms are, through to the extent to which we employ people on hourly paid contracts to deliver the prime function, the teaching. So all sorts of things could be transformed. They're legally permissible, and the mechanisms of cooperative educational institutions exist to allow them. So in a way, it's an enormous thing. Maybe it's too big, I don't know, but I just wanted people to know that it's possible, because quite often ideals are seen as unachievable and people turn away from what's unachievable, because who wants to waste their time on something that will never happen? It's utopian dreaming. So I just think it's possible.
Isn't the arts is in the business of the imagination and inventing, reimagining what we could conceive. Professor Malcolm Quinn's reminds us of his point once again, that the culture is implicated. And here's his quote: Bourdieu said, quote, "There is no exit from the game of culture. What do you think?"
I don't want to exit. I want to stay in it. I love it. It's just my life, really. Well, culture is why I stay, why I keep going. It's a living thing that keeps changing. It's like a walk in the forest in a way. It's constant, but it's also dynamic and continually changing in surprising and beautiful ways.
Thank you. And we're pretty much at time. Can I give you a final word, Janine? Only if you want. I'm not.
Sorry. I'm never going to get used to like having to unmute. David, you said something really interesting about having a different model, and I think there's something there about giving our space the ability to imagine differently, right? And I'm always intrigued about what stops us, like what stops us from having the radicality, because we're in an art school. Like, if we can't do it here, where else could we possibly not do this work, right? So I'm intrigued about the ways in which that we need to start accepting that the current systems that we have are not sustainable. Like, we're all literally going to die. I'm sorry, but like, if we maintain how things are going, it's not sustainable. So surely the time is high for us to start imagining and thinking and doing different types of systems and operations to sustain ourselves, to keep ourselves preserved. And that's something that I'd like us to end on and think about.
Thank you. And in doing that, you connected me with David Isaac's quote from James Baldwin. And I was reading The Fire Next Time, rereading it. I first read it many years ago, doing my first broadcasting job. And I came back to that essay, and I just want to offer a sentence inspired by David. And it's his, that collection, I think, includes an essay which was originally published in the New Yorker, is A Letter from a Region of My Mind. I think
love that.
It's from that, and he closes it in a similarly visionary way to what Janine is gesturing towards. And here it is. Here's the quote: "If we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and relatively conscious blacks, who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of the others, if we do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. If we do not now dare everything, the fulfillment of that prophecy, recreated from the Bible in a song by a slave, is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time."
Wow, beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of alarmingly prescient, the way that Baldwin tries to navigate the racial nightmare, as he puts it 50 years ago, and alarming how resonant that still is. We're pretty much at time. I want to repeat my huge thanks to you, Janine, and to you, David, and also to Nigel, to David, and everybody who's helped with this event, Charlotte Hodes, particularly Lynn Finn, So this is our opening event. I hope that this has whetted the appetites for some further discussion. Lots of events, as we've said. The link is there in the chat. I know that our research centres have got an event planned, our new institutes conceived and delivered by Simon O'Phil Kerr. They are doing a special event. There are many, many others. We're going to be looking at ethics. A number of the research directors are leading an exploration of what do we mean by ethics in this context. It feels to me like the beginnings of many urgent conversations. So my thanks to you for your clarity, your directness, for really kind of setting a light and seeing, I think it's now on each of us to see how we take up these ideas, how we make them our own, and offer our students, staff and others in our communities a way of re-looking, which in these times, you know, if nothing else, isn't that what a university is for? So I'm very grateful to you all. Thanks for everybody who's attended today. I hope we will see you soon on some of the other events coming. Research season runs for a month, and it was conceived originally by Professor Oriana Badley. Huge thanks to her. And do have a look at the comments in the chat and appreciation of you both. And we look forward to continuing research season. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Pratap.